Allow yourself for a moment to do nothing at all. Let whatever you have been carrying today set itself down somewhere nearby. Not discarded, only rested. You do not need to hold it right now. The weight of the day, the small urgencies that kept demanding your attention, the unfinished thoughts that keep circling, let them grow soft at the edges, the way sound softens when a door is gently closed. You are somewhere quiet now. You are somewhere safe. Breathe in slowly, and as you breathe out, let your body remember what it feels like to be still. This is where we begin. Tonight we are going to travel a very long way, not in miles, and not in years, as we normally count them. Though years will pass in this story, many thousands of them, and the distance involved is the kind that makes the imagination go quiet with something close to awe. We are going to travel to a galaxy that existed a long time ago, in a part of space that the night sky above you does not show. We are going to find a civilization at the height of what it believed was its permanence, and we are going to sit quietly with it as it moves, slowly and without knowing, toward the thing that would unmake it entirely. There is no need to follow every detail. Simply let the story carry you, the way a slow river carries something that has stopped resisting the current. The Galactic Republic had existed, at the time our story begins, for approximately 25,000 years. Let that number rest in your mind without trying to fully contain it. 25,000 years. When the earliest human civilizations on distant worlds were still learning to press marks into clay, the Senate of the Republic was already ancient. When empires that considered themselves eternal had risen and crumbled into dust so old it no longer remembered what it had once been, the Republic was already holding its deliberations in that vast domed chamber on the city world of Coruscant, already sending ambassadors to newly discovered systems, already doing the patient administrative work of holding more than 10,000 worlds together under a single shared order. It was not a young thing. It was one of the oldest continuous political institutions that had ever existed in the history of sentient life in that galaxy, and it carried its age the way very old things carry theirs, with a kind of gravity that could look, from a certain distance, like strength. Coruscant itself was the physical expression of what 25,000 years of civilization could produce, when it had enough space and enough ambition. The entire surface of the planet was a city. Not a city with edges, with suburbs that dissolved into countryside, with dark patches on a map where the lights ran out. A city without interruption, built layer upon layer over millennia, until the original surface of the planet was buried under hundreds of levels of structure, unreachable now except in the deepest and most lightless places, where the architecture of 100 ages pressed down together, and the corridors between the oldest buildings smelled of stone and metal and time. At the upper levels, where the light was good and the air was clean, and the Senate dome caught the perpetual glow of the planet city's own illumination, and threw it back in a soft gold arc against the sky, it was genuinely beautiful. The kind of beautiful that has been refined over so long a period that it no longer calls attention to itself, the way a gesture made by someone who has performed it for decades becomes invisible inside its own ease. The Senate met in that dome, tinned. Thousands of delegates from thousands of worlds, each in their own floating pod, each representing the particular concerns of a civilization that had trusted the Republic with its membership and was waiting, in the way that constituent peoples always wait, for the institution to prove that the trust had been wisely given. The debates that filled that chamber were not always inspiring. They were often in truth precisely as slow and procedurally entangled as the debates of any large deliberative body in any age of any civilization, governed by rules whose origins had been forgotten, and whose purpose was less the pursuit of justice than the management of disagreement, at a scale that would otherwise have been unmanageable. There were committees, there were subcommittees. There were procedural motions that could delay a vote for months, and interest groups that had been shaping the outcomes of those votes for generations through methods that stopped just short of the formal definitions of corruption. The Republic was old, and like most old things, it had accumulated around itself a layer of habit and compromise that insulated it from the sharp edges of real change. Sit with that for a moment. 25,000 years, the oldest institution in the known galaxy, grown so large and so settled in its ways that it could no longer easily imagine that it might one day simply stop. This is the Republic at the beginning of our story. Vast and ancient and genuinely impressive, and already, in ways that almost no one understood yet, deeply compromised by its own accumulated weight. The cracks were not visible from a distance. They required a very particular kind of attention to see, and most of the people who might have had that attention were occupied with other things. The Jedi Order was among the oldest institutions in the Republic, and it had served alongside the Senate for millennia in a relationship whose precise nature was sometimes difficult to describe clearly. They were not the Republic's military, though they could and did act in that capacity when circumstances required. They were not its law enforcement, though they maintained peace in places where conventional law could not easily reach. They were guardians of a kind, and diplomats of a kind, and philosophers of a kind, and their authority derived not from any formal grant of political power, but from the Force, from their long cultivation of their relationship with the living energy that moved through and connected all things, and from the reputation for wisdom and integrity that 12,000 years of service had built around them. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant was older than most of the other structures on the planet, and the archives within it contained knowledge that predated the Republic itself, records of a time when the Order had been smaller and the galaxy had been younger, and the boundary between what was understood and what was mystery had lain much closer to the centre of human experience. The Jedi were trained from very early in life, selected when they were still small enough to be carried, before the patterns of ordinary attachment had fully formed, before the specific loves and fears of a particular childhood had settled into the nervous system and made certain kinds of learning impossible. This was done for reasons that the Order's philosophy justified carefully, and that its history appeared to confirm. A Jedi who formed deep personal attachments was a Jedi who could be swayed by them, who could be led through love or grief away from the calm, principled centre that the Force required. The training was long, and the expectations were high, and the philosophy was demanding in the way that philosophies tend to be demanding when they have been developed by people who took their responsibilities seriously over very long periods of time. The Jedi were not without compassion. The misunderstanding that compassion and attachment are the same thing was one of the Order's most useful distinctions and one of its most consequential limitations, though this would not become fully clear until much later. What the Jedi did not know, as our story begins, was that they were being watched, had been watched in fact for decades, studied and assessed and measured for vulnerability by someone who understood them far better than they understood themselves, who had spent years learning the precise architecture of their strengths, and had found, in the careful examination of that architecture, the specific weaknesses that would eventually be used against them. This figure had not announced himself. He had not declared his intentions or revealed his philosophy, or given any indication of the nature of the game he was playing. He had instead done something considerably more patient and considerably more dangerous, which was to make himself indispensable to the very institutions he intended to dismantle. His name, in his public life, was Sheev Palpatine, and he represented the mid-rim world of Naboo in the Galactic Senate. He was not, when our story opens, a particularly notable figure. He was a skilled and well-regarded senator, known for his moderation and his ability to find common ground in difficult deliberations, valued for the quality of his political judgment and the quiet, reliable competence with which he navigated the Senate's complex social geography. People who worked alongside him found him pleasant and trustworthy, a man whose ambition was legible and appropriately calibrated, who wanted advancement in the way that politicians want advancement, without seeming to want anything beyond what the system's own logic would naturally provide. He was the kind of person who makes others feel comfortable, who creates around himself an atmosphere of reasonable good sense that makes the people in it feel that they are in the presence of someone who can be relied upon. He had cultivated this impression with the care of someone who understood that the most effective concealment is not disguise but misdirection, not the wearing of a false face but the provision of a true face that shows only what is useful to show. Palpatine was a Sith Lord. He had been trained in the tradition of the dark side of the Force, an order that had spent 1,000 years building toward a single purpose after its near annihilation at the hands of the Jedi. The Sith philosophy of that era, shaped by a single teacher known as Darth Bane, insisted on a particular structure, 2 practitioners at a time and never more, a master to embody power and an apprentice to desire it. This arrangement was not arbitrary. It was a response to the historical pattern by which Sith Lords had repeatedly destroyed each other in the competition for dominance, draining the tradition of its strength through internal conflict at the very moments when external pressure required unity. 2 was the number that maintained tension without producing destruction. 2 was the number that kept the tradition alive across the centuries, passing from master to apprentice in the shadows while the Jedi and the Republic believed, not without reason, that the Sith had been extinguished entirely. They had not been extinguished. They had simply become very quiet and very patient and very good at waiting. Palpatine had spent years learning to wait. He had spent years watching the Republic from the inside, cataloguing its weaknesses, understanding which of its institutions could be leveraged and which could be hollowed out and which could be turned against themselves when the right moment arrived. He understood that the Republic's greatest vulnerability was not military or economic, but structural. That a system of government built on the management of consensus among thousands of competing interests was a system that could be paralyzed by the deliberate introduction of the right kind of irresolvable conflict. He had not yet introduced that conflict. The moment had not yet arrived, but he was watching it approach, with the patience of someone who has planned for a very long time and who understands, at the deepest level, the difference between motion and arrival. In the outer reaches of the Republic, in the systems that the Senate's attention did not often reach, the first murmurs of what would become the separatist crisis were beginning to form. These were not at first the sounds of organized opposition. They were the sounds of accumulated grievance, of worlds that had found the Republic's promised protections inconsistent, that had experienced the Senate's deliberations as irrelevant to their actual circumstances, that had been waiting for attention and assistance that had arrived late or inadequately or not at all. The trade routes that crossed the Outer Rim were governed by corporations whose interests the Senate had consistently placed above the interests of the systems those corporations exploited, and the worlds at the edges of Republic space had noticed this pattern with the specific clarity that comes from being on the receiving end of a system that was designed with other priorities in mind. Their grievances were real. This matters. The forces that would eventually tear the Republic apart were not built entirely on deception. They were built on real suffering, real disappointment, real and legitimate anger at an institution that had failed to honour its obligations to its most distant members. This is the weight of it, and it deserves a moment of stillness. The Republic that would fall was not a pure and simple thing corrupted by a single villain. It was a complex and genuinely human institution, or rather, a complex and genuinely sentient institution, built by creatures who were trying their best within systems that had been shaped by centuries of compromise, and its failure was not entirely imposed from the outside. Palpatine did not invent the Senate's corruption. He found it already there. He did not create the Outer Rim's grievances. He simply learned to use them. The tragedy of the Clone Wars, when it arrived, would be a tragedy built on real foundations, which is the only kind that cuts all the way through. Let your body grow heavier now, press gently into whatever is supporting you. The Republic is still at peace, for the moment. The Senate is still deliberating in its vast dome, the light still falling gold across the planet city below. The Jedi are still in their temple, still training their students in the long, patient disciplines of the Force, still moving through the galaxy as its guardians without knowing that the ground beneath that role has been slowly, carefully, invisibly undermined. The war has not yet begun. There are still years of ordinary life happening in this galaxy. Crops being harvested on agricultural worlds, students arriving at academies to learn trades that have nothing to do with conflict, families eating their evening meals on the upper levels of Coruscant while the city glows around them in every direction. These ordinary lives are still intact. The story is not yet what it is about to become. Breathe out slowly and let the image of that golden city settle into the quiet behind your eyes. There is more to come, much more, because what follows is one of the most consequential conflicts in the history of that galaxy, a war that was fought on 100 worlds simultaneously, and that changed everything it touched, from the smallest individual life to the shape of the civilization itself. But that is for the coming segments, for other quiet nights when you are ready to go deeper into the story. For now, there is only this. The Republic at the edge of what it did not yet know was coming, and the slow approach of something that had been planned for a very long time in the dark. Come back to your breath. If your mind has been busy since we last settled together, that is entirely natural, entirely fine. The mind does what minds do, which is move, and the work of this hour is not to force it still, but to give it something slower to move through, something that asks less of it than the ordinary world does. Let your shoulders drop. Let the air come in and go out at its own pace. You are here again, in the quiet, and the story is here waiting for you exactly where it was left, in a galaxy far away and a very long time ago, in the long shadow of something that had been growing in the dark for centuries before anyone thought to look for it. To understand the Clone Wars, you have to understand the Sith, and to understand the Sith you have to go back further than the war itself, back past the Separatist crisis, past Palpatine's careful decades in the Senate, past the childhood of anyone who would fight in the conflict that was coming. You have to go back roughly 1,000 years to a battlefield on a planet called Ruusan, where the Sith Order as it had existed for millennia finally destroyed itself, and where one man survived to build something new from the rubble of everything that had been lost. The story of the Clone Wars begins, in one very real sense, on that battlefield, in the mind of a single survivor, in the specific thought that arrived in him as he looked at what the old ways had produced and understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has just watched a tradition consume itself, that the tradition required a fundamental reimagining if it was ever to accomplish anything at all. The Brotherhood of Darkness, as the old Sith collective had called itself in those final years, was in many ways the logical conclusion of everything the Sith philosophy had always contained. The dark side of the Force, as the Sith practiced it, was not a philosophy of cooperation. It was a philosophy of power, of the individual will pressing against the limits that nature and society and the ordinary structures of existence imposed upon it, refusing those limits, consuming the Force's dark energies to overwhelm them. This was not in itself a philosophy that produced collaboration easily. The Sith who gathered under the Brotherhood of Darkness were each pursuing their own hunger, each measuring themselves against every other member of the collective, and finding, in every assessment, that the presence of so many others diluted the power that each individual could claim. They were an army of people each of whom believed, with genuine and practiced conviction, that they deserved to be the only one. The conflict this produced was not incidental to their philosophy. It was its natural expression. The Battle of Ruusan was the point at which that expression became terminal. The Sith and the Jedi had been fighting across that planet for 7 engagements, each one more costly than the last, and when the final confrontation arrived, it took with it almost every Sith who remained. Not primarily because of Jedi action, though the Jedi were present and fought with everything they had, but because of a thought bomb, a weapon of pure dark side Force energy that a Sith Lord named Khan detonated in the belief that it would destroy his enemies and preserve his allies. It destroyed everyone it touched without meaningful distinction. The Sith who survived the battle could be counted on very few hands. The one whose survival would matter most to the next 1,000 years was a man who had already separated himself from Khan's collective before the final detonation, who had seen what was coming with enough clarity to remove himself from its path, and who stood afterward in the silence of a battlefield that had consumed an entire tradition and understood that he was, for practical purposes, the last. His name was Darth Bane. He was not gentle. He was not a figure who inspires the kind of admiration that comes easily and without complication, and the philosophy he developed in the years following Ruusan was not a philosophy of redemption, or wisdom in any ordinary sense. It was a philosophy of survival and strategy, built by someone who had looked at 1,000 years of Sith history and identified the single recurring mechanism of failure with the precision of a diagnostician who has no interest in comforting the patient, only in identifying the disease. The disease, Bane concluded, was accumulation. Too many Sith, each diluting the power of every other, each competing for the energies that the dark side offered in greater abundance to those who held them alone. The Brotherhood had been an organization of rivals pretending to be colleagues, and it had destroyed itself as such organizations always do from the inside through the force of its own internal contradictions. Let that settle for a moment. A tradition that had existed for millennia, that had fought wars and shaped history and terrified the Jedi Order across countless generations, reduced in a single afternoon to the quiet of a devastated landscape, and one man standing in it, thinking. There is something in that image that asks to be held gently, not because Bane deserves sympathy exactly, but because the moment itself has a weight that goes beyond his particular character, the weight of something very old ending, the weight of someone alone with the full inventory of everything that has been lost, deciding what, if anything, should be built from what remains. What Bane built was the rule of two. The principle was expressed simply enough: 2 Sith, and only ever 2. A master to embody the power, an apprentice to desire it. The apprentice would learn everything the master knew, and when the apprentice had learned enough, when the apprentice's hunger had been carefully cultivated to the point where it exceeded the master's capacity to contain it, the apprentice would kill the master and take a student of their own, carrying the tradition forward by destroying the person who had transmitted it. This was not a design flaw, it was the design. The killing of the master was the graduation ceremony. The tradition perpetuated itself through the controlled, deliberate, philosophically mandated destruction of each of its own teachers. The genius of it, and it was a genuine genius even in the service of something deeply cold, was that it eliminated the dilution problem entirely. There was no brotherhood to fracture into factions. There was no collective competing for the dark side's energies. There were 2, and only 2, and the tension between them, the master's need to shape the apprentice without being destroyed prematurely, the apprentice's hunger to grow without revealing the fullness of their strength before the moment was right, kept the tradition taut and alive without allowing it to collapse under its own internal weight. It was also, and this is the part that the galaxy did not understand for 1,000 years, extraordinarily patient. 2 people keeping a secret across generations, passing it forward through the specific intimacy of the master-apprentice relationship, required no armies, and no territory, and no public declarations of intent. It required only the willingness to wait. The chain of masters and apprentices that followed Bane across the centuries is not fully documented even in the most complete archives that the Jedi Order maintained, because the Jedi believed for most of that period that there were no Sith left to document. They had looked at the silence following Ruusan and interpreted it as extinction, which was exactly what Bane had intended them to conclude. Each Sith Lord who carried the tradition forward during those long centuries lived a life of profound concealment, operating within ordinary society or within the Republic's own institutions, learning to be invisible inside the structures they intended to eventually use against the world that housed them. They were bankers and politicians and scholars and merchants and all the other things that people can be in a complex civilization, and behind each of those identities was the same patient, centuries-long project, the cultivation of power in the dark, the waiting for the right convergence of conditions. By the time the story that would become the Clone Wars was approaching its beginning, the chain had reached a man named Darth Plagueis, and through him, the young Naboo politician who would take the name Darth Sidious. Plagueis was, by the standards of the tradition he had inherited, a genuinely extraordinary practitioner, someone who had pushed the philosophy of the dark side into territory that previous Sith Lords had theorized about but not reached, into the manipulation of midi-chlorians, the microscopic life forms through which the Force expressed itself in living beings, into what the Sith texts called the ability to influence life and death at the most fundamental biological level. He was a philosopher as much as a practitioner, someone who understood that power without understanding was only destruction, and who wanted something more precise and more lasting than destruction. He found in Palpatine an apprentice whose particular gifts were not primarily physical or even directly force-based, but political and social and psychological, an apprentice whose power would express itself not through combat, but through the manipulation of systems, of institutions, of the patient architecture of other people's decisions. Think for a moment about what Palpatine carried with him into every Senate chamber, every diplomatic reception, every quiet conversation with a colleague he was carefully cultivating. He carried the knowledge of what he actually was, in a setting where that knowledge would have produced immediate and overwhelming response if it had ever become visible. He carried the full awareness of the tradition he was serving, the centuries of patient waiting that had preceded him, the specific weight of being the person in whom all of that waiting was about to arrive at its purpose. He sat in committee meetings and debated trade legislation, and offered measured, reasonable counsel to colleagues who found him trustworthy, and somewhere beneath all of that, in a part of himself that he kept absolutely still and absolutely separate from everything the Senate saw, the dark side of the Force moved through him with the quiet certainty of something that has been waiting a very long time and can feel, at last, that the waiting is almost over. This is the tradition that would eventually place its instruments on every side of the Clone Wars, that would engineer the conflict itself, arm both armies, position its practitioners in the roles that would give them the most leverage over the outcome. Dooku, who would lead the Separatists under the name Darth Tyrannus, had been recruited by Palpatine with the care of someone selecting the right tool for a specific task, chosen for his combination of genuine disillusionment with the Republic's failures and the kind of aristocratic pride that could be reliably directed. Maul, trained in secret from childhood, was something more personal, a weapon built entirely to specification, formed by the Sith tradition without the complications of a prior life that might introduce loyalties the tradition had not sanctioned. And waiting further back in the plan, not yet placed on the board but already identified and already being carefully, invisibly shaped, was a young man named Anakin Skywalker, in whom the Force moved with an intensity that no living being had ever been measured to possess, and whose particular emotional architecture, the deep loves, the deep fears, the desperate need to protect what he could not bear to lose, made him, in Palpatine's assessment, the most promising instrument the tradition had ever been given to work with. But that is further into the story than we are tonight. Tonight we rest here, at the beginning of it, in the long quiet before the conflict arrives. The Sith tradition has survived 1,000 years of invisibility. Its practitioner sits in the Senate and waits. The galaxy does not know that it is being watched, being measured, being prepared. The Jedi move through their temple and their missions and their philosophy, feeling something they cannot quite name, a shadow at the edge of perception, a disturbance in the Force's living texture that their training tells them is significant, but that their understanding of the galaxy's current political reality cannot account for. Something is coming. The Force knows it. But the names and the shapes of what is coming are not yet visible, and in that interval between the knowledge that something is approaching and the arrival of the thing itself, there is still, for a little while longer, something that resembles peace. Let your body go heavy now, the way it goes heavy when the day's last resistance has finally released, when there is nothing left that requires holding. The galaxy is still quiet out there in the dark between the stars. The Senate is still deliberating. The Jedi are still training. And in the shadows of an institution that does not yet know it is carrying a patient darkness at its centre, the long plan continues its last few years of waiting. There is no urgency here, in this telling. There is only the slow, soft approach of the next part of the story, which will find you rested and ready when it comes. For now, let the image of starlight carry you, the vast, unhurried light of a galaxy that is, for this last quiet interval, still intact. Settle in again. Let the weight of wherever you are, the mattress beneath you, the pillow that has shaped itself to the particular angle of your head, remind you that you are held. You do not have to hold yourself right now. Gravity is doing that work, and it is very good at it, and you can simply let it. Breathe slowly and let the breath come all the way in before you release it, and let the releasing be unhurried. The way water moves when it has no particular destination, you're back in the story. The story has been here the whole time, waiting with the patience of things that do not need to be anywhere else. We're going somewhere very specific tonight, to a planet that most citizens of the Republic had never heard of, that did not appear on the most commonly used star charts, that existed at the edge of the known galaxy in a region of space, characterized primarily by the kind of persistent heavy rain that falls on worlds where the ocean and the atmosphere have reached a kind of ongoing negotiation from which neither ever fully retreats. The planet was called Kamino. It was an ocean world, entirely ocean, from pole to pole, with no landmass anywhere on its surface that would have merited the word. What existed instead were the platforms, vast stilted structures rising from the water, on supports engineered to absorb the constant movement of the swells, their surfaces white and clean and slightly reflective in the grey diffuse light that the cloud cover allowed through, their interiors maintained at a temperature and humidity calibrated not for the comfort of visitors, but for the requirements of the work being done inside. The work being done inside Kamino's facilities was the most extraordinary act of biological engineering that the galaxy had ever attempted at scale. The Kaminoans, tall, long-necked beings whose movements had the quality of something that had evolved in water and not entirely adjusted to air, whose pale skin seemed almost luminous against the white of their own architecture, had been in the business of cloning for generations. It was not a sideline or an experiment. It was the entirety of their economic and intellectual identity, the thing they did better than anyone else in the galaxy and knew it, the capability that had brought them to the attention of the person who had eventually arrived on their world with a commission that even they, experienced as they were, had taken a moment to absorb fully. The commission was for an army, not a small force, not a specialized unit, not the kind of military capacity that a single system might reasonably need for its own defense. An army for a republic, an army of millions. The genetic template for this army was a man named Jango Fett. He was a bounty hunter, one of the most skilled practitioners of that particular profession in the galaxy, a man whose competence in violence was matched by his discretion about the clients who employed it, whose personal history was complicated in ways that he did not discuss, and that the Kaminoans had not been engaged to assess. What they needed from him was simpler than his history. They needed his genome, his physiological profile, his baseline cognitive and physical architecture, the raw biological material from which millions of copies could be drawn and developed and trained. He agreed to provide this, and he was paid for it, and he lived on Kamino during the years of the army's development in the kind of proximity to the project that suggested either a personal investment in its outcome or a simple preference for the compensation it provided. He had, as part of his arrangement, requested one unmodified clone, a son raised as his own, who would carry his face and his name, but not the accelerated aging or the behavioral conditioning that the military contract required. The boy's name was Boba. Pause here for a moment and breathe. There is something in the image of that transaction that carries a weight worth sitting with. A man selling the blueprint of himself, his face, his hands, his particular configuration of bone and muscle and nervous system, to be reproduced by the millions, each copy trained to fight and likely to die in a war whose full purpose he was not told, and from the same source material one child kept back, unmodified, personal, the vast and the intimate existing side by side in the same arrangement, the industrial and the human occupying the same contract. Let that image rest in the quiet for a moment before we continue. The clones that the Kaminoans grew from Jango Fett's template were, in the most precise biological sense, human. They were not synthetic beings in the way that droids were synthetic. They were not constructed from components or programmed with behavioral parameters entered through an interface. They were grown, developed in the accelerated way that the Kaminoans had mastered, their biological aging compressed to roughly half the standard rate, so that a soldier ready for combat could be produced in a decade rather than 2, but grown nonetheless from the same cellular processes that produce every other human being in the galaxy. They had nervous systems and immune responses, and the capacity for pain, and the capacity for hunger, and the capacity for something that, if it had been occurring in a being whose origin was less institutionally convenient, would have been recognized immediately and without question as consciousness. What the design also gave them, and this is the part that would only become fully visible much later, was an inhibitor chip. Embedded in each clone's brain during development, these chips were presented to the Jedi and to the Republic's military leadership as behavioral regulators, devices to prevent the kind of uncontrolled aggression that might be expected in soldiers trained from infancy to fight, a safeguard built into the design for everyone's protection. The true purpose of the chips was something else entirely, something that only the person who had commissioned the army from the beginning fully knew, a mechanism for overriding the clone's own will at a specific command, for converting 10,000 years of developing individual personality and loyalty and genuine care into a single uniform response, targeted and total. The chips were not a safeguard. They were a weapon aimed inward, at the people carrying them, waiting for the order that would fire it. But the clones did not know this. They lived and trained and developed their personalities in the long years before the war began with all the ordinary reality of beings who simply are what they are, without the knowledge that something inside them had been designed to one day contradict everything they understood themselves to be. They gave each other names. This is perhaps the most quietly significant thing about the clone army, and the one that most resists the clinical framework of their origin, that human beings, even beings grown from a single template in a laboratory on a rain-soaked ocean world, and trained since the earliest age they could comprehend anything to be soldiers, will find ways to become distinct from each other. They will notice the specific things that interest them and the specific things that do not. They will develop preferences and habits and private jokes, and the particular kind of loyalty that comes from sharing an existence with people who know exactly what you face, because they face the same thing. Their names reflected this individuality with a simplicity that was somehow more affecting than elaborate self-expression would have been. Some took names that described physical features, a scar, a particular way of wearing their armor, a habit that made them recognizable. Some chose names that came from languages other than basic, words that had meanings their brothers understood. Some were given names by the Jedi they served alongside, which carried its own kind of weight. The acknowledgement from someone outside the template that you were specific, that you were this person, and not simply a copy of a design. Rex, Cody, Fives, Jesse, Wolf. These names exist now in the memory of everyone who knows this story, and the fact that they exist, the fact that they were chosen and kept, and that the people who bore them became known by them, is itself a kind of refusal, an insistence on particularity in a context that had been designed to produce interchangeability. Captain Rex, who would serve alongside Anakin Skywalker and become one of the most significant soldiers of the entire Clone Wars, was a man of genuine and serious moral intelligence. He thought about what it meant to follow orders, about the distinction between obedience and complicity, about whether the duty of a soldier extended beyond the execution of commands to something more difficult, the ongoing assessment of whether the commands themselves were worth executing. He did not resolve these questions easily or permanently. He carried them with him through the war with the specific weight of someone who understands that the questions matter and who refuses to set them aside simply because the setting aside would be more comfortable. He was brave and competent and genuinely cared about the men under his command in a way that was not performance and not programming, but something that had grown in him over years of shared experience, the same way it grows in anyone. Commander Cody served under Obi-Wan Kenobi, and their relationship had the quality of genuine professional respect deepening over time into something that both of them probably would have described, if asked, as friendship, because that is what it was. Obi-Wan spoke to Cody as he spoke to any colleague whose judgment he trusted and whose company he valued, and Cody responded with the ease of someone who had been seen clearly and found it comfortable rather than exposing. When Order 66 came, and we are not there yet in this telling, that moment is still many chapters ahead. What Cody did was not a betrayal in any sense that he controlled, was not a product of his character or his choice, or anything that his years of relationship with Obi-Wan had failed to prevent. The chip fired, and Commander Cody, who had genuinely cared about the man he served beside, became, for the duration of the Order's execution, someone who could not access that caring. This is one of the cruelest things in the entire story. It deserves to be named as such, but we are not there yet. The war has not yet begun. The army is still on Kamino, still training in those white corridors while the rain moves across the ocean outside and the Kaminoans move through their facility with the unhurried precision of beings engaged in work they consider straightforward. The clones are drilling and learning and naming each other and becoming, in the unhurried way that people become themselves, the specific individuals they will be when the conflict finally arrives and asks everything of them. They do not know what is coming. They know that they were made for it, in the abstract sense that the training has always pointed toward eventual deployment. But the specific shape of what will be required, the specific worlds and the specific battles and the specific losses that each of them will carry, is still ahead, still unformed, still belonging to a future that has not yet happened. Let your breathing go soft now. Let the image of Kamino settle. The rain on the ocean, the white platforms rising from the water, the lights inside the facility steady and warm against the grey of the perpetual overcast. Somewhere in those corridors, millions of faces that all wear the same face are finding, in the small private spaces of their developing selves, the specific things that make each of them different from every other. They are becoming people in the only way that people ever become people, which is slowly and without announcement, through the accumulation of small experiences and the particular ways that each individual responds to them. They will fight. Many of them will not survive, but they will have been, in the truest sense, real. And the war that is coming will be fought, on one of its sides, by people whose existence was itself an act of quiet insistence on being more than what they were designed to be. Rest here for a moment. The story will continue when you are ready, and there is no hurry. Let the weight of what was born on Kamino, the strangeness and the beauty and the tragedy of it settle into the quiet dark behind your eyes. The rain falls on the ocean. The platforms hold. The people inside are still becoming who they will be. And somewhere far away, on a desert planet, on a city world, in the chambers of a Senate that does not yet know the army being built for it exists, the conditions for the war are still assembling themselves, piece by careful piece, in the hands of someone who has been patient for a very long time. You are back. Let that be enough for a moment, simply the fact of being here again, in the quiet, in the dark or the near dark, in whatever posture your body has chosen for this particular hour. There is nothing you need to do right now except breathe, and your body already knows how to do that without any instruction from you at all. Let your jaw unclench if it has been holding. Let your hands go open. The story is here, exactly where you left it, patient as old stone, and it will carry you further tonight into the long history of a conflict that changed everything it touched. You only need to listen. Everything else can wait. By the time the crisis that would become the Clone Wars had reached the point of visibility, the point where ordinary senators and journalists and citizens on 1,000 worlds began to understand that something serious was happening, that the political order they had lived inside for their entire lives was under a pressure it might not be able to absorb. The foundations of that crisis had already been laid for years. This is the nature of large political fractures. They do not begin at the moment they become visible. They begin much earlier, in the accumulation of smaller failures, in the decisions not made, and the grievances not addressed, and the corruptions not corrected, in the long, slow drift of an institution away from the principles it had claimed to embody. By the time the crack appears on the surface, the structure behind it has already been compromised in ways that the surface alone cannot show. The Outer Rim worlds had been expressing their dissatisfaction with the Republic's governance for decades, before anyone in the Senate found the urgency to address it seriously. Their complaints were specific and consistent. The trade routes that crossed their systems were controlled by corporations, primarily the Trade Federation and its various associated commercial interests, whose relationship with the Senate was characterized by the kind of mutually beneficial arrangement that is technically legal and functionally indistinguishable from the purchase of political outcomes. These corporations set the terms under which Outer Rim worlds could participate in the galactic economy, and those terms reliably reflected the corporations' interests rather than those of the populations the trade was supposed to serve. When Outer Rim worlds raised these concerns through the Senate's formal channels, their concerns moved through committees with the slow, grinding patience of things being managed rather than addressed, emerging months or years later in recommendations that were carefully worded to be acceptable to the corporate interests they were nominally regulating. Into this landscape of accumulated frustration stepped a figure whose capacity to give that frustration a direction and a philosophy was, in retrospect, precisely what Palpatine had been counting on. Count Dooku of Sereno was one of the most respected figures in the galaxy when he resigned from the Jedi Order, a master of uncommon skill and genuine philosophical depth, a man whose personal integrity had never been seriously questioned, and whose opinions on matters of galactic governance carried the weight of someone who had spent decades observing the Republic from the inside, and had arrived, through careful and honest assessment, at conclusions that were difficult to dismiss as the grievances of someone with nothing to lose. He had everything to lose. He resigned anyway. He gave up his place in an order he had served for his entire adult life, his standing in a community of practitioners whose respect he had earned through decades of genuine effort, his role in the institution that had been the centre of his identity. He gave all of this up because he had concluded, and could not be talked out of the conclusion, that the Republic was corrupt beyond the capacity of internal reform to correct. Sit with Dooku for a moment, because he deserves the attention. His disillusionment was not manufactured. The things he was disillusioned about were real. The Senate's corruption was real. The Trade Federation's stranglehold on Outer Rim commerce was real. The Republic's failure to protect its most distant members was real and documented, and had been real and documented for longer than most people currently serving in the Senate had been alive. Dooku had watched the institution he served ally itself, year after year, with the interests of the powerful at the expense of the interests of everyone else, and he had raised his objections through the proper channels and watched them be absorbed without effect, and he had eventually reached the point where continued participation felt less like service and more like complicity. This is a genuine moral position. It is the position of a person paying attention. The tragedy of Dooku is not that his diagnosis was wrong. It is that his response to a correct diagnosis led him somewhere that made everything worse. He had been found by Palpatine in the period of his disillusionment, during the years when his doubts about the Republic were fully formed but his path forward was not yet chosen. Palpatine had approached him with the care and precision of someone who understood exactly which doors to open and in what order, who had identified in Dooku the specific combination of genuine principle and wounded pride that would make him receptive to what was being offered. The offer was not presented as Sith recruitment, not immediately, not in those terms. It was presented as an opportunity, a chance to build something different from the failed institution, to give the legitimate grievances of the Outer Rim worlds a political structure and a voice, to lead a movement that might accomplish through secession what reform had failed to accomplish through participation. Dooku's title in this movement would be Head of State of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. His name in the Sith tradition would be Darth Tyrannus. He accepted both. The Confederacy of Independent Systems was, on its surface, what it claimed to be, a coalition of worlds and commercial interests that had concluded their needs were better served outside the Republic than within it. Many of the worlds that joined it had genuine reasons for doing so, reasons rooted in the same Outer Rim experience of neglect and exploitation that Dooku had identified and articulated with real, persuasive force. The movement had actual support from actual populations who believed, with some justification, that the Confederacy represented their interests more faithfully than the Senate ever had. This matters for understanding what the Clone Wars actually was, at the level where ordinary people lived it. It was not a war between a legitimate government and a collection of cynical aggressors. It was a war in which both sides contained real people, with real beliefs and real stakes, in which the complexity of the political situation had been deliberately cultivated by someone who understood that wars fought over genuine disagreements are harder to end than wars fought over manufactured ones. The event that converted the brewing crisis into something that could no longer be contained within the Senate's procedures was a sequence of assassination attempts on Senator Padme Amidala of Naboo, former Queen, current Senator, one of the most vocal opponents of a military creation act that would have authorized the Republic to raise an army in response to the separatist threat. The attempts on her life were traced through a chain of investigation that Jedi Knight Obi-Wan Kenobi followed with his characteristic methodical patience, to a bounty hunter named Zam Wesell, and, behind her, to Jango Fett himself. The trail from Fett led Obi-Wan somewhere that the investigation had not anticipated, to Kamino, to the white platforms rising from the ocean, to the Kaminoans who greeted him with the polite certainty of people who'd been expecting a representative of the Jedi Order, and were mildly puzzled that it had taken this long for one to arrive. What Obi-Wan found on Kamino, the army, the clones in their millions, the whole extraordinary apparatus of biological engineering that had been operating in secret for a decade, was information that the Jedi Order and the Senate had to process in real time, under pressure, with the separatist crisis accelerating and the political situation deteriorating faster than the deliberative pace of the Republic's institutions could manage. There was no time for the kind of careful, principled examination of what the army's existence meant, of who had commissioned it and why, and whether accepting it was consistent with everything the Republic and the Jedi Order claimed to stand for. There was only the crisis, and the army, and the question of whether to use what had been found or to set it aside and face the separatist military build-up with the resources already available, which were plainly insufficient. In the Senate, the debate was moving toward its conclusion with the inexorable quality of a vote, whose outcome has already been determined by the conditions surrounding it, rather than by the arguments being made within it. Senator Amidala argued against the Military Creation Act with the directness and genuine conviction of someone who understood, from her own experience governing Naboo through the Trade Federation's blockade, that the authorization of military force in the name of security had a way of becoming permanent before anyone had quite noticed the transition. She was right about this. Her argument was correct in its diagnosis and in its prediction. It did not prevail, because correct arguments made in legislatures under crisis conditions frequently do not prevail, because the emotional and institutional pressures bearing down on those making decisions in such moments are not primarily responsive to the quality of the arguments being made. The emergency powers granted to Chancellor Palpatine in the wake of the crisis, granted by a Senate that believed it was making a temporary and necessary concession to extraordinary circumstances that believed the powers would be returned when the emergency had passed, were the most consequential vote that body ever took, more consequential than any of the members understood at the time, more consequential than most of them would ever fully understand. Palpatine accepted these powers with the visible reluctance of someone being asked to take on a burden they would rather have declined, with the gracious humility of a public servant agreeing to serve beyond what the role would normally require. The performance was flawless, which it could afford to be, because it had been rehearsed over years of patient preparation for exactly this moment. He had the army, he had the powers, he had both sides of the coming war under his influence. What remained was only to let it begin. There is something in the arc of this sequence that carries a particular kind of sorrow, not the sorrow of sudden loss, which is sharp and immediate, but the sorrow of watching something give way that you understand has been weakening for a long time. The Republic did not fall all at once. It gave itself away, vote by vote, in each small surrender to the argument that the emergency justified the exception, in each incremental transfer of power from the many to the one that was framed as temporary and practical and necessary. The senators who voted for Palpatine's emergency powers were not fools or villains. Most of them were people doing their best under conditions that had been deliberately engineered to make their best insufficient. This is how the oldest democracy in the galaxy began its transformation into something else, not through conquest, not through sudden violent overthrow, but through the willing, incremental, procedurally legitimate surrender of everything it had been built to protect. Let your breathing slow. The Senate chamber is quiet now, the vote recorded, the outcome settled, the shape of what comes next already determined by decisions that have just been made. On Coruscant, the lights of the city spread in every direction to every horizon, as they always have, as they will continue to do through everything that follows, because cities do not stop glowing when their political structures change. Ordinary life continues in all its ordinary forms, meals and conversations and the small private urgencies of individual lives, while the large structures that shape those lives reconfigure themselves around a new centre. Most people do not feel the change yet. The change is real. The war is about to begin. Rest here for a moment, in the stillness before the first battle. The crisis has resolved into something worse than the crisis, into the clarity of a conflict that is now inevitable, that all the deliberation in the galaxy could not prevent because the deliberation itself was part of the design. Breathe out slowly and let the Senate chamber, with its thousands of pods and its history of 25,000 years, and its vote that has just changed everything, grow soft and distant in your mind. The story will continue. There is more to carry you through. But for now there is only the quiet before the first shots, and the last few hours of a peace that does not yet know it is ending. Let your body settle deeper into whatever is holding you. There is no urgency here, no requirement, nothing that asks anything of you, except the willingness to remain still and let the story move through you at its own pace. The breath comes in and goes out, and goes. The room around you is quiet. Somewhere very far away, in a galaxy that existed long before this one, and will not be found by any telescope aimed at the night sky above you, the last hours of peace are passing without anyone quite recognizing them as such. Let that distance carry you. Let the story begin again from exactly where it left us, at the edge of the first battle, in the hours before the shooting started, when the war was still only a shape approaching from the dark. Geonosis was not a beautiful world. It was a desert planet of rust-red rock and heat, its surface carved by ancient erosion into formations that had the quality of things that had been broken and had not been repaired, that had simply remained broken and had allowed the breaking to become their characteristic shape. The atmosphere was thin enough to be uncomfortable and thick enough to be breathable, a marginal condition that suited the Geonosians who inhabited it, insectoid beings of considerable engineering intelligence who had built their civilization into the rock itself, in vast hive structures whose internal geometry had the quality of something grown rather than constructed, following the logic of biological necessity rather than aesthetic choice. It was not a world that invited lingering. It was a world for work, for the specific kind of work that required remoteness and deniability, and facilities large enough to manufacture things on a scale that the more populated and more observed worlds of the inner systems would not have accommodated. What was being manufactured on Geonosis, in the months leading up to what would become the first battle of the Clone Wars, was the military hardware of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, the droid foundries running at capacity, producing the battle droids and super battle droids and destroyer droids that would form the backbone of the Separatist army, turning raw materials into the mechanized soldiers that Count Dooku's coalition would deploy across the galaxy once the conflict he was preparing for finally arrived. The scale of the operation was industrial in the way that only things built without public scrutiny can be industrial, without the constraints that visibility imposes, without the negotiations and regulations and competing interests that slow the production of things when the people affected by them have a voice in how they are made. The foundries ran without pause. The droids came off the lines in their thousands. Obi-Wan Kenobi arrived on Geonosis following the trail that had led him from Kamino, tracking the connection between Jango Fett and the assassination attempts on Padme Amidala through the specific patient logic that characterized everything Obi-Wan did, the willingness to follow a thread wherever it led without deciding in advance where it should go. What he found exceeded the scope of the investigation he had been conducting. The Separatist leadership was meeting on Geonosis. Count Dooku was there. The droid foundries were there. The full shape of what was being prepared, the military capacity, the political alignment, the readiness for a conflict that the Confederacy had been building toward while the Senate deliberated, was visible on that rust-red world in a way it had not been visible anywhere else. He transmitted what he had found before he was captured. The transmission reached the Jedi Council, and, through them, the Republic, and set in motion the response that would make Geonosis the place where the war began. Breathe slowly. Let the dry heat of that desert world settle at a comfortable distance, present in the imagination but not pressing, the way a landscape in a story always is, vivid but not demanding. What happened next on Geonosis was the first large-scale deployment of the clone army, the first time those millions of identical faces that had been training on Kamino's white platforms were brought to a battlefield and asked to do the thing they had been made to do. 200 Jedi arrived first, in the arena where Obi-Wan and Anakin and Padme had been brought for public execution, and for a few minutes the battle had the quality of something almost mythic. The Jedi, vastly outnumbered, standing in the center of a droid army that surrounded them on every side, the colored light of their lightsabers moving in the dust. And then Yoda arrived with the clone army, and the nature of the engagement shifted entirely. The Battle of Geonosis lasted hours. It was fought across the planet's surface, in the arena and in the rocky terrain beyond it, in the air above the formations and on the ground between them. The clones fought with the disciplined efficiency of beings who had been training for exactly this since they were old enough to hold a weapon, responding to orders and to each other with the coordination of people who had spent years learning to function as a single organism without losing their individual judgment. The Jedi who led them found themselves in a role they had not trained for, and had not most of them chosen, the role of military commanders, of generals responsible for the lives of the soldiers under them, and for the strategic objectives that the battle required. They adapted with the characteristic Jedi quality of bringing their full attention to whatever the present moment required, setting aside the philosophical questions that the situation raised, because the situation did not have time for philosophical questions. Count Dooku fought Obi-Wan and Anakin and then Yoda in the final movements of the battle, and what those confrontations revealed was the full measure of what he had become since leaving the Jedi Order. The dark side's energies running through him with a fluency that only comes from years of practice, his lightsaber work carrying the precision of a master who had added entirely new dimensions to a skill that had already been extraordinary. Obi-Wan and Anakin were not his match that day, individually or together. Yoda was, or close enough to it that the engagement ended not in victory for either of them but in Dooku's escape, his evacuation from Geonosis carrying with him the plans for something that the story will return to, something vast and spherical and terrible, whose construction had already begun in the most remote reaches of the galaxy. The Death Star's blueprints left Geonosis in Dooku's hands. This too was part of the plan. The Republic declared victory at Geonosis, and in the narrow military sense it was a victory. The droid foundries disrupted, the separatist leadership scattered, the immediate threat to the sector contained. But Dooku had escaped. The Confederacy had not been destroyed, only pushed back. The clone army had been deployed, and having been deployed could not be undeployed, and the Republic that now possessed an army of millions was already, in the ways that matter most, a different kind of institution from the one that had existed before the battle. Armies change the things that have them. The possession of large-scale military force creates its own logic, its own pressures, its own arguments for how the force should be used, and those arguments are not always easy to resist from within the institution that is making them. The Jedi who survived Geonosis returned to a republic that needed them as generals now rather than as peacekeepers, that was already organising the clone army into divisions and assigning Jedi to command them, that was moving with the institutional momentum of an organisation that has just discovered it is at war and is reshaping everything it has toward the requirements of that war. The Jedi Council accepted these assignments with the measured gravity of people who understood that the alternative, refusing to lead the army, leaving the Republic's military forces without the force-sensitive commanders who could coordinate them most effectively, was a worse outcome than the one they were choosing. They were right in the narrow logic of the immediate situation. They were also in committing themselves to something that would change their order in ways they could not yet fully see, binding the Jedi identity to the military identity of the Republic in a way that would eventually make it very difficult to separate the two. There is something worth pausing over in the image of the Jedi on that battlefield. These were people whose entire philosophical tradition was oriented toward the living force, toward the cultivation of presence and compassion, and the patient navigation of the space between action and stillness. Their weapons were instruments of precision, meant for defense and for the resolution of specific confrontations, not for the management of large-scale military campaigns across multiple systems simultaneously. And yet there they were, on a rust-red world under a hot sky, commanding clone battalions and making tactical decisions, and carrying in their hands the lives of the soldiers who looked to them for direction. They did it well, because Jedi training produces people who can do most things well, who have the discipline and the presence to meet whatever is in front of them with their full capability. But doing it well is not the same as it being the right thing for them to be doing, and the distance between those two assessments would take years of war to fully open. Geonosis was the beginning in the most literal sense. The first shots, the first casualties, the first day of a conflict that would last 3 years and touch every corner of the galaxy and leave nothing it encountered unchanged. The people who fought there on both sides went home carrying the specific weight of having been in the first battle of a war, which is a different weight from the weight of later battles, because later battles arrive in a context that the first battle has already established, a context of ongoing conflict that the mind has had time to adjust to. The first battle arrives without that context. It arrives in the gap between what things were before it and what they will be because of it, in that vertiginous moment when the future the battle creates is not yet real, but the past it has ended already is. Let that image soften now. The battle is over. The dust of Geonosis is settling back onto the rust-red rock. The clone army is reorganizing, the casualties being counted, the officers composing their reports in the language of military assessment that converts the experience of violence into the administrative record of it. The Jedi are quiet, in the way that people are quiet after something large has happened that they understood to be coming and find, now that it has arrived, to be even larger than they anticipated. The war has begun. It has its first battlefield and its first day and its first dead. Everything that comes next will come in the shadow of this beginning, shaped by what happened here, building on the foundation that this day has laid. The Republic is at war. The galaxy is different from what it was this morning. And somewhere on a ship leaving Geonosis, Count Dooku is carrying plans that the story is not finished with yet. Breathe out slowly and let the desert world go dark behind your eyes. You have been to the first battle and witnessed its weight and its beginning, and now you can rest in the quiet that follows any large event. The stillness that arrives when the immediate noise has passed, and the full shape of what has happened is still too large to hold all at once. The story continues. The war goes on from this day for 3 years across systems and worlds and lives too numerous to count. But tonight, in this hour, you can simply let it rest. The first day is done. Close your eyes a little further. Let the story carry you toward the deep water of sleep, where everything is held without effort and nothing needs to be carried. Come back to stillness. Let the breath arrive without you reaching for it, and let it leave the same way, unhurried, automatic, the body doing what it does when the mind is quiet enough to stop managing it. If thoughts have been moving through you in the time since we last gathered here, that is entirely natural, and you do not need to chase them away. Simply let them pass the way weather passes, acknowledged, not argued with, moving through rather than staying. You're here again. The story is here. The war has begun on a rust-red world called Geonosis, and the galaxy is reorganizing itself around that fact, and the people who will carry the weight of what comes next are already in motion, already being changed by the thing they have agreed to do. The Jedi Order had existed for 12,000 years as the guardians of peace in the galaxy. Not its army, not its generals, its guardians. A distinction that carried within it an entire philosophy of engagement, an entire understanding of what the Force asked of those who served it and what it did not. The Jedi were trained to be present, to be responsive, to bring their attention fully to the specific situation in front of them, and to act from that attention with precision and without excess. Their training was not training for war in the way that the clone army's training was training for war. It was training for clarity, for the ability to perceive without distortion, and to act without the clouding of fear or anger, or the desire for outcomes. These are qualities that serve a soldier well, but they are not the same as the qualities that a military command structure requires, and the gap between them would become one of the defining tensions of the Clone Wars. Master Yoda had accepted the role of Grand Army of the Republic's highest military commander, with the measured gravity of someone who understood the full weight of what he was accepting. He was, at 900 years of age, the most experienced living practitioner of the Force's light side, a being whose wisdom had been accumulated across so many decades of service that his counsel had become something the Order and the Republic both treated as foundational, not infallible, because Yoda did not claim infallibility, and would have been suspicious of anyone who did, but grounded in a depth of experience that made his assessments worth taking seriously even when they were uncomfortable. He accepted the command because the alternative was to leave the army without the kind of leadership that could connect its military objectives to the larger purposes they were supposed to serve. He accepted it knowing that the acceptance was a compromise, that it placed the Jedi in a relationship with institutional power that the Order's tradition viewed with careful wariness. He accepted it, and he carried the weight of having accepted it throughout the years of war that followed. Mace Windu was perhaps the most formidable combatant in the Jedi Order during the Clone Wars period, a master of a lightsaber form called Veapad that walked closer to the dark side's edge than any other technique the Jedi sanctioned, that drew on the practitioner's own inner darkness and redirected it through the precision of the engagement rather than suppressing it. He was not a warm figure in the way that some Jedi were warm. He was exact and confident and carried a quality of authority that came from genuine capability rather than from any effort to project it. The kind of authority that does not need to announce itself because the people around it can feel it without the announcement. He served on the Jedi Council with the seriousness of someone who understood that the decisions made there carried consequences for people who had not been asked and would not be consulted, and he brought to those decisions a rigour that was sometimes uncomfortable for his colleagues precisely because it did not soften its conclusions for the sake of the people who would have found softer conclusions easier to accept. Rest here for a moment. Consider what the Jedi were being asked to become, not overnight, but gradually, campaign by campaign, battle by battle, and what that gradual becoming cost them. They were asked to send soldiers into situations where some of those soldiers would die, and to make the calculations that determined which situations were worth that cost. They were asked to hold in their minds simultaneously the immediate tactical requirements of military engagement and the longer-term purposes that those engagements were supposed to serve, and to ensure that the immediate never completely consumed the longer term, even when the immediate was loud and urgent and the longer term was quiet and abstract. They were asked to do all of this while maintaining the inner clarity that the Force required of them, while keeping the dark side's temptations at the distance that their training had prepared them to maintain, while being beings whose entire identity had been built around peace, now spending their days in the management of organized violence. Obi-Wan Kenobi bore this tension with more visible grace than most, which did not mean he bore it without cost. He was by nature a diplomat, someone whose instinct was to find the resolution that required the least violence, to exhaust every other possibility before arriving at the one that ended with people dead. The war forced him to arrive at that conclusion earlier and more often than his instincts preferred, to function as a military commander on battlefields where the diplomatic option had already been foreclosed before he arrived. He adapted because adapting was something Obi-Wan did with the practiced ease of someone who had spent his entire adult life learning to be fully present to whatever situation the Force placed him in. But the adaptation required the consistent suppression of something genuine in him, and the suppression of genuine things, even when it is necessary, even when it is right, leaves marks that do not always show immediately. His relationship with Anakin Skywalker, his former Padawan, and now his colleague and the most powerful Force-sensitive being either of them had ever encountered, was the deepest personal relationship of Obi-Wan's life, and it complicated his role as a military commander in ways that he managed carefully and imperfectly. Anakin was brilliant in battle with the specific kind of brilliance that comes from a combination of extraordinary natural ability and the complete absence of the hesitation that caution produces. He saw solutions that other commanders missed, executed maneuvers that other commanders would have assessed as too dangerous, and brought his men through situations that should, by any reasonable analysis, have been unsurvivable. He was also impulsive and emotionally volatile and carried attachments so deep that they constituted in the Jedi Order's assessment a vulnerability that his battlefield gifts did not compensate for. Obi-Wan knew both of these things about him and loved him anyway, which is perhaps the most human thing about Obi-Wan Kenobi, and which made everything that came later the specific kind of devastating that only the deepest loves can produce. Ahsoka Tano arrived in the war as Anakin's Padawan, assigned to him by Yoda, in a decision that was widely understood within the Order as an attempt to give Anakin the experience of responsible mentorship, to introduce into his life the specific kind of care that requires placing another person's development above your own immediate needs. She was young when the war began, younger than the war deserved, and she grew up inside it with the particular quality of maturation that conflict produces, faster in some ways than the alternatives, and marked in ways that the alternatives would not have marked her, carrying in the specific texture of her adult judgment, the evidence of everything she had seen and survived before she should have had to see or survive any of it. She was also genuinely extraordinary, in her own right, and not merely as a reflection of her master's gifts, and her relationship with Anakin became one of the genuine bonds of the war. Two people who understood each other at a level that the official structure of their relationship only partially explained. The Jedi who served as generals across the 3 years of the Clone Wars were, in aggregate, a portrait of what the Order contained at its best and most human. Ki-Adi-Mundi, thoughtful and precise. Plo Koon, whose care for his clone troopers was genuine and personal, and expressed itself in the specific attention he paid to their individual well-being, in a context that treated them primarily as a collective resource. Luminara Unduli, whose serenity was not distance but the particular quality of someone who has done the work of understanding the Force's relationship to impermanence, and has found in that understanding something that holds even in the loudest moments of battle. Shak Ti, whose task on Kamino, overseeing the clone training program, placed her at the intersection of the war's most ethically complex question, responsible for the beings whose existence raised questions that the Republic had decided not to ask officially, and that she could not avoid asking privately. What the Jedi generals shared, beneath all their individual differences of temperament and approach and philosophy, was the experience of being changed by what they were doing. War changes people. This is not a controversial observation. It is one of the most thoroughly documented facts about the human, and near-human, and non-human experience of organized violence. It changes the people who participate in it, in ways that are not always visible and not always reversible, in ways that sometimes strengthen and sometimes damage, and that always, in some register, leave evidence of having happened. The Jedi were not immune to this. Their training gave them tools for managing the changes, for maintaining the inner clarity that the Force required even in the midst of conditions designed to undermine it. But the tools were not perfect, and the conditions were severe, and the war was long. By the middle of the conflict, the Jedi High Council was aware that something in the Order was under pressure that it had not been under before, that the long immersion in military command was producing in some of its members a relationship to power and to action that was subtly different from the relationship the Order's training had intended to cultivate. The awareness was genuine. The response to it was limited by the same constraints that had limited every other response the Order had attempted to the conditions the war created. the awareness that the alternative to continuing was not clearly better, that stepping back from the military role would leave the Republic's forces without the leadership they had come to depend on, that the argument for continuing was always available and always compelling, even when the cost of continuing was becoming visible in the faces of the people paying it. Let your breathing go gentle now, as gentle as it can go while still being breath. The Jedi are in the field, across 100 systems simultaneously, carrying in each of them the same fundamental tension between what the Force asks and what the war requires. They are extraordinary people doing an impossible job with genuine dedication and real cost, and the story does not forget this even as it moves toward the places where the cost becomes the thing that matters most. They deserved better than the war gave them. Most of them did not know this yet. The knowing was still ahead, in the events that the story has not yet reached, in the moments that would make clear what the years of service had actually been building toward. Rest in the quiet of this moment, between the battles. The Force moves through the galaxy like a tide, touching everything, felt most clearly in the stillness between engagements when the noise of the war recedes enough for the underlying current to be heard. The Jedi feel it in these moments, the living energy that connects all things, the presence that their training has taught them to listen to, that does not stop speaking simply because the world around it has grown loud. They feel it, and they carry it forward, and the story carries them forward too into the next segment of what happened and why, and what it means that it happened the way it did. For now, there is only the stillness. Let it hold you. Let your eyes stay closed. Let everything grow a little quieter than it was a moment ago. Breathe in, slowly, and let the breath go all the way down. Let it reach the places your body has been holding without knowing it was holding them, the small tensions that accumulate through a day of being alive in the world and that only release when you give them a reason to. Breathe out and let the releasing be complete. You are in the quiet again. The story is here. Tonight we go somewhere more interior than the battlefields, more interior than the Senate chambers and the political architectures of crisis and collapse. Tonight we go into a single life, the life that sits at the center of the Clone Wars story more than any other, the life that the entire elaborate machinery of Palpatine's plan was ultimately designed to reach and to reshape. Tonight we spend time with Anakin Skywalker, and with the wound that was inside him long before the war began. He was found on Tatooine, a desert world like Geonosis but older in its desolation, worn down by twin suns to a landscape of ochre sand and scattered rock settlements, where people lived at the margins of the Republic's attention, and learned, in that marginality, a particular kind of self-reliance that the more central worlds never needed to develop. He was 9 years old when Qui-Gon Jinn arrived in his life, and what Qui-Gon found in him, the midi-chlorian count that exceeded any measurement previously recorded, the raw force sensitivity that expressed itself in reaction times, and spatial awareness, and a quality of physical grace that should not have been possible in a child that age, was, by the Jedi Order's standard framework for assessing potential, the most extraordinary thing any living Jedi had ever encountered. He was, Qui-Gon believed, the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy, the chosen one, the being who would bring balance to the Force. The prophecy did not specify what balance meant, or what it would cost to achieve it. His mother's name was Shmi, and she remained on Tatooine when Anakin left for Coruscant, and the leaving was the first wound. He was 9 years old, and he loved his mother with the complete, unguarded love of a child who's had only one source of warmth and safety in a world that offered very little of either, and the separation from her was not something the Jedi Order's training fully equipped him to process, because the Order's training was not designed for beings who arrived at 9, with attachments already formed and already essential. Younger children, taken before those attachments had fully consolidated, could be guided through the philosophical framework of non-attachment, with the natural ease of people learning a language before the critical period has passed. Anakin arrived after the critical period. He arrived having already loved someone with his whole heart, and the teaching that this kind of love was a path to the dark side reached him not as wisdom, but as a demand that felt, at its deepest level, like a request to be less than he was. He became the most talented Jedi of his generation regardless, because his gifts were so extraordinary that even the complications of his formation could not prevent his development, because his intelligence and his physical capability and his connection to the Force were all operating at a level that made him, in purely practical terms, nearly impossible to match. He was also, throughout his years as a Padawan and then as a knight, genuinely good, genuinely motivated by the protection of others, genuinely horrified by suffering, genuinely committed to using what he had been given in the service of something larger than himself. These qualities were real, and they were his, and they were not diminished by the other things he also was. The pride, the impatience with what he perceived as the Order's unnecessary constraints, the volcanic emotional intensity that the Order's philosophical framework could contain in theory, but that expressed itself in practice as a recurring pressure against whatever structure had been built to manage it. Pause here and let the weight of that be what it is, a being of almost incomprehensible force sensitivity, shaped by a childhood of poverty and slavery, and a profound love that was then placed under a philosophy that told him the love was dangerous, sent into a war that asked him to exercise his gifts in the service of organized violence while maintaining the inner stillness that his training required. These are not conditions designed to produce ease. These are conditions designed to test the specific fracture lines that every human being carries, to find the places where the architecture of a person has been built on something that has not fully set, and to apply pressure there until something either strengthens or gives way. The Jedi Order was not cruel in creating these conditions. It did not intend harm. But intention and outcome are different things, and the outcome, in Anakin's case, was a man who carried inside him a wound that the war made larger with every year that passed. Padme Amidala was the senator from Naboo, former queen, one of the most significant political figures in the Republic, and Anakin had loved her since he was 9 years old, and she had been kind to him on Tatooine in the specific way that genuine kindness from a person you admire when you are 9 years old leaves a mark that does not fade simply because years have passed and circumstances have changed. They married in secret, secretly because a Jedi Knight with a wife was a contradiction of the Order's core requirements, because the attachment that marriage represented was precisely the attachment that the Order had been trying to prevent him from forming, because making it known would have required a confrontation with the institution he served that neither of them, for different reasons, was ready for. The secret itself became part of the wound, the daily maintenance of a division between the self that served the Order and the self that came home, the energy required to keep two versions of your life from touching, in ways that would make both of them impossible. Shmi died. This is one of the most consequential events in the history of the galaxy, though it did not announce itself as such. It was the death of one woman, on one world, in the hands of raiders who had taken her, and from whose hands Anakin arrived too late to save her. He found her alive, briefly, and held her while the last of her life passed, and what happened in him in that interval and in the hours that followed was not something that the Jedi training had prepared him for, and not something that he allowed anyone to fully see. He did not grieve in the way that the Force and the Jedi tradition offered him to grieve, with the calm acceptance of impermanence that years of training had tried to cultivate in him. He raged, and the rage found its expression in violence, and the violence was not selective. He returned to Padme not as someone who had experienced a loss, but as someone whose relationship to his own capacity for darkness had been irrevocably changed by the discovery that it was larger than he had known. He told Padme what he had done. He told her in the specific way that people tell the person they trust most about the thing they are most ashamed of, haltingly, with the quality of someone placing something in front of another person and waiting to see if the placing will be survived by the relationship. She did not turn from him. She held what he told her with the compassion of someone who understood that the person she loved had done something terrible, and that the terribleness did not negate the love, and her response to him in that moment, her refusal to flinch away from what he was showing her, became one of the foundations of the bond between them, and also one of the mechanisms by which the wound stayed open. Because being seen clearly in your worst moment by someone who remains present is one of the most bonding experiences that human beings have, and it bound Anakin to Padme in a way that made the loss of her, years later when it came, the specific lever that Palpatine had been waiting to use. Throughout the Clone Wars, Palpatine cultivated his relationship with Anakin with the patience and precision of someone who had identified exactly what kind of attention the wound required. He was present in ways the Jedi Council was not. He expressed confidence in Anakin's judgment and his gifts, without the qualifications that the Council's assessments always carried. He positioned himself as someone who understood Anakin, in the specific way that a person feels understood when someone reflects back to them the version of themselves that they most want to be true, the version in which the gifts are acknowledged without the complications, in which the impatience with constraints is framed as wisdom rather than pride, in which the intensity of the love is a virtue rather than a vulnerability. The portrait Palpatine showed Anakin of himself was not entirely false. That was what made it so effective. The Chosen One prophecy stayed with Anakin throughout the war as a source of both purpose and pressure. Purpose because it offered a framework for understanding why his gifts were so extraordinary, why the Force had made him what he was, why the specific combination of his capabilities and his position at the centre of the war's events might be pointing towards something larger than the battles themselves. Pressure, because prophecy is a difficult thing to carry when you're also trying to be an ordinary person with ordinary relationships and ordinary fears, when the gap between what you're supposed to be and what you experience yourself to be in your most private moments is wide enough to generate, in a person of Anakin's particular emotional constitution, a sustained low-level dread that the prophecy will somehow reveal itself to have been about someone else, that the extraordinary gifts will turn out to be insufficient for the extraordinary purpose, that the Chosen One is a role you are being asked to fill, and that you will find, at the critical moment, that you are not quite equal to it. Breathe slowly. Let the interior landscape of that life settle into the quiet. The gifts, and the wound, and the love and the fear and the war moving through all of it, like weather through a landscape that was never quite stable enough to weather it without changing. Anakin Skywalker was real, in all the ways that matter for understanding what happened. He was not a symbol or an allegory, though the story makes him both of those things as well. He was a person, a deeply specific, deeply human person, whose particular configuration of strength and damage made him the most important individual in the history of that galaxy. The hinge on which everything turned, the point where the story of the Republic and the story of the Sith and the story of the Force itself all converged into a single life, and asked more of it than any life was designed to give. The war continues around him and through him, and because of him, in ways he does not yet fully understand. The wound stays open, the love deepens and the fear deepens with it, the two growing together as they always do in people who love what they cannot protect. Palpatine waits, the Force moves. And somewhere in the space between what Anakin was made to be and what he is becoming, the most consequential transformation in the history of that galaxy is still years away from completing itself, still moving toward the moment where everything changes. For now, he is still Anakin. For now, the story is still in motion toward what it will become. Let that motion carry you gently, like a slow river, toward the deep and quiet rest that is waiting somewhere further along the current. Let everything slow down. Let the breath set the pace, unhurried, reliable, the one rhythm in the body that continues regardless of what the mind is doing, the one signal that is always available to return to when everything else has grown too loud. You are here. The story is here. Tonight we go to the place that everything else in this telling has been pointing toward, to the centre of the web, to the figure who held the threads of both armies in his hands throughout 3 years of galactic war and whose patience, measured against the scale of what he was waiting for, remains one of the most extraordinary acts of sustained concealment in the history of that galaxy, or perhaps any other. Tonight we spend time with what Palpatine was actually doing while the Clone Wars burned. The war looked, from within it, like a war between two sides. The Republic and its clone army on one side, the Confederacy of Independent Systems and its droid forces on the other, with the Jedi Order serving as the Republic's military leadership, and Count Dooku serving the same function for the Separatists. This is what the war looked like. What the war actually was is something different, something that requires stepping back from the battlefield perspective to the perspective of the person standing at sufficient distance to see all of it at once, far enough back to observe both armies, both command structures, both political frameworks and all the ordinary people caught inside them, and to understand that the conflict consuming them had been designed, from its earliest foundations, by a single intelligence operating simultaneously on both sides. Palpatine had commissioned the clone army under the identity of a Jedi Master named Sifo Dyas, using a name that belonged to a real person, a Jedi who had genuinely believed a great conflict was coming, and who had attempted, without the Council's sanction, to arrange for the Republic's military preparation. Dooku had ensured that Sifo-Dyas did not survive to complicate the arrangement. The commission therefore existed in the records as the act of a Jedi the Order already knew, whose motivations were comprehensible within the Order's own history, whose name on the paperwork explained the army's existence in a way that pointed away from its actual origin. The misdirection was elegant, not a fabrication layered over nothing, but a real history with one crucial substitution made at the point of authorship. On the Separatist side, Dooku served as the public face of the movement while serving as Palpatine's apprentice, which meant that Palpatine was simultaneously the Chancellor of the Republic prosecuting the war and the Sith Master of the Man leading the opposition. Every major strategic decision on the Separatist side passed through Dooku, and Dooku's ultimate loyalty was not to the Confederacy's member worlds or to the genuine grievances of the Outer Rim populations who had joined the movement in good faith, but to the man on Coruscant whose plan those populations were unknowingly serving. When Palpatine needed the Separatists to advance, they advanced. When he needed them to retreat, the war was a performance with 2 stages and 1 director. Sit with the scale of this for a moment. Every clone who died on a Separatist battlefield, every droid that was destroyed by a Republic engagement, every senator who cast a vote in response to the war's latest development, every Jedi who made a tactical decision based on their assessment of the enemy's movements, all of these people were operating inside a theatre whose entire staging had been arranged by one man watching from the director's seat. The grief was real, the suffering was real. The courage was real on both sides, in all the ways that courage is always real regardless of whether the conflict requiring it was honestly arrived at. But the conflict itself had been constructed from the outside by someone who needed it, for purposes none of its participants had been asked about or informed of. The Separatist Council, the collection of corporate leaders and planetary governors who believed they were directing the Confederacy's political agenda, were kept at careful distance from Dooku's actual chain of command, which ran not through them but directly to Palpatine. They were provided enough information to feel that they were in control of the movement they had joined, enough victories and enough political momentum to maintain their conviction that the Confederacy represented a genuine alternative to the Republic rather than an instrument of the Republic's own Chancellor. The most effective deceptions do not create false information from nothing. They provide true information selectively, in quantities calibrated to satisfy the recipient's need to understand their situation, without revealing the actual shape of the situation they are inside. The council members were not foolish people. They were people operating inside a framework designed specifically to prevent them from seeing it as a framework. The banking clans and trade guilds that funded the Separatist military were themselves operating under the impression that a Confederacy victory would produce a galaxy more favourable to their commercial interests, fewer regulatory constraints, more direct access to the Outer Rim trade routes, a political arrangement in which economic power translated more directly into political authority than the Senate's complex deliberative structure permitted. Palpatine had made commitments to these interests through intermediaries who would not survive to call the debts. The financial architecture of the war was as thoroughly manipulated as its military architecture, and the beings who believed they were investing in a future that served them were in fact funding the construction of an empire that would render their independence more theoretical than the Republic had ever managed. What Palpatine needed the war to accomplish was threefold, and all 3 purposes were being served simultaneously throughout its 3-year duration. The first was the concentration of power. The emergency powers granted by the Senate in the conflict's early days were never intended to be returned, and each new development provided fresh justification for their continuation and expansion, each crisis making the argument for centralized authority more compelling, and the argument for restoring the Senate's previous powers more abstract and more easily dismissed. The second was the exhaustion and demoralization of the Jedi Order. 3 years of war, of the specific moral and psychological costs of military command, of being asked to be something the Order had never trained its members to be, was precisely the preparation Palpatine needed for the moment when the Order would be asked to respond to a threat from a direction they had not been watching. The third purpose was Anakin. Everything else in the plan was preparation for this: the accumulation of emergency powers, the exhaustion of the Jedi, the 3 years of war that had brought Anakin into daily proximity with Palpatine and daily distance from the Order's philosophical grounding. Palpatine needed Anakin specifically, because the alternative, Anakin remaining Jedi, remaining the Republic's greatest military asset, possibly being the one capable of stopping what Palpatine intended, was a risk the plan could not absorb. The war was in part a delivery system for getting Anakin Skywalker to the place where the offer Palpatine intended to make would be the one he could not refuse. Dooku knew most of this and not all of it. He knew he was Palpatine's apprentice and that his role was to serve the larger plan. He did not know the plan included his own eventual replacement, that Palpatine had identified in Anakin a successor whose raw power exceeded Dooku's in every measurable dimension, making Dooku, for all his genuine skill and genuine usefulness, ultimately a transitional figure. The Sith rule of two allowed the Master to accelerate that replacement when a superior candidate presented itself. Dooku's death, when it came, was not a failure of the plan. It was a scheduled outcome built into the plan from before the war began. The Outer Rim sieges in the war's final year brought the conflict to its most geographically extended and most strategically critical phase. With clone and separatist forces engaged across dozens of systems simultaneously, the Jedi stretched thin, the Senate preoccupied in ways that left little attention for the domestic political situation, quietly moving into its final configuration on Coruscant. Palpatine allowed himself to be captured by Grievous during this period, a calculated vulnerability pulling Anakin and Obi-Wan into the rescue that would end in Dooku's death at Anakin's hands, beginning the final movement of the plan's most important relationship. Nothing about Palpatine's situation during this period was accidental. Let your breathing soften. The war is approaching its end, though the people fighting it do not yet know this. They know only that it has been 3 years and it continues, that the Outer Rim is still contested, and the casualties are still accumulating, and the Force still carries, in its living current, the sense of something large approaching from a direction that none of the Order's considerable collective perception has yet resolved into a clear shape. Something is coming. The Jedi can feel it, the way you feel weather before it arrives, in the quality of the air, the behaviour of the light. They cannot see it clearly enough to act on what they feel, and this inability is one of the cruelest dimensions of what they are about to experience. Palpatine has been patient for longer than most people can imagine being patient, and the patience is almost at its end. The pieces are in place. Anakin stands at the edge of the particular desperation Palpatine has been carefully cultivating for years. The love and the fear and the wound, all at a point of pressure that requires only the right offer at the right moment. The Jedi sense the darkness. The Senate has surrendered the tools that might have protected it. The war has done everything it was designed to do. What comes next is not a battle. It is a conclusion. The arrival of the thing that has been approaching since before the war began, since Darth Bane stood alone on the battlefield at Ruusan and decided the tradition required reimagining. 1,000 years of patience is almost finished. Let your eyes rest. The story carries you forward. Stay with your breath. This is a quieter segment than what the subject might suggest, because the way we hold the heaviest things is not with noise, but with the specific stillness that very heavy things require. The stillness of someone sitting with something that matters, giving it the full quality of their attention without being overwhelmed by it. Tonight's story carries real weight. It is the story of an ending, of the most catastrophic single event in the history of the Jedi Order, and it deserves to be told carefully at the pace that careful telling requires. Let your body be heavy and your mind be open, and let what happened move through this hour at the speed of something being genuinely honoured, rather than merely recounted. The moment that became known as Order 66 had been engineered for years before it arrived, built into the architecture of the clone army at the most fundamental biological level, and into the political situation of the Republic at the most fundamental institutional level, so that when the command was finally given, it would find every mechanism already in place and every pathway already cleared. The Order itself was simple in its language, a designation, a number, a category of contingency response that had been embedded in the clone command structure alongside dozens of other contingency orders, unremarkable in its placement and therefore unexamined by the Jedi who fought alongside clone troopers for 3 years without ever thinking to ask what Order 66 contained. The answer was the Jedi themselves. Palpatine gave the order from Coruscant, following a confrontation with the Jedi Council that had itself been engineered, a confrontation in which Mace Windu led a small group of masters to arrest the Chancellor and found, in that confrontation, the full measure of what Palpatine actually was. Mace had suspected. The Council had been moving towards certainty for weeks, gathering evidence through the patient intelligence work that the Force sensitivity of its senior members made possible, building toward a moment of action that would have, had it arrived differently, changed everything. What happened instead was that Anakin chose the other side, chose the hope that Palpatine had offered, the hope of a Force knowledge the Jedi had refused to teach him, the hope that might save the person he could not bear to lose. He chose it, and Mace died, and Palpatine had what he needed. Across the galaxy, in that same extended moment, clone troopers who had fought alongside Jedi generals for 3 years looked at the people beside them with the specific blankness of beings whose own will had just been overridden by the mechanism embedded in their biology, and they acted on the order with the efficiency of soldiers executing a command their training had made automatic. This is the part that requires the most careful holding. The fact that the troopers who carried out Order 66 were not, in any philosophically coherent sense, acting from their own volition. Rex fought the override with the full force of his considerable strength of character, and did not entirely succeed. Cody, standing on a rocky canyon world, watched Obi-Wan fall into the river below the blastfire and did not climb down to confirm what he had been ordered to confirm, and whether this was the inhibitor chip's incomplete coverage or something else, something that had survived the override in some residual form, the story does not fully resolve. Breathe here. Let this be what it is, a moment of real weight in a story that has been building toward this weight for 9 segments, and that deserves to have the weight acknowledged rather than softened. The Jedi who died on those battlefields were specific, developed, individual people whose names and whose relationships and whose years of service we have spent this entire compilation building toward being able to feel as something more than abstract loss. Plo Koon, who had cared for his troopers with genuine personal attention, died in his fighter over Cato Nemoidia when his clone escort opened fire. Aayla Secura fell on Felucia in a jungle that had no witness except the troopers who ended her. Ki-Adi-Mundi turned to face the sound of the safeties releasing behind him on Mijito with the expression of someone who understands, in the last available instant, exactly what is happening. Obi-Wan survived because the fall was long enough and the water deep enough, and because the Force, or chance, or both, kept him from the specific outcome the Order required. Yoda survived because his connection to the living Force was deep enough that the Order's coming reached him through the Force's own current, a fraction of a second before it reached the troopers beside him on Kashyyyk. A fraction of a second that was enough for someone of his capability to use. These survivals were not planned by Palpatine, not engineered into the outcome the way so much else had been engineered. They were the small, uncontrollable residue of a plan that was otherwise almost perfect, the gap between design and execution that exists in every system, however carefully constructed, because reality does not fully submit to even the most comprehensive planning. On Coruscant, in the Jedi Temple itself, Anakin Skywalker had already crossed the threshold that he would not be able to uncross. Palpatine had given him a new name, Darth Vader, and a mission that was the formal expression of everything the old name had been holding back, everything the years of training and the years of war and the years of carrying the wound had been building pressure against. He went to the temple not as a Jedi returned to the place of his formation, but as the instrument of that formation's destruction, carrying the lightsaber that had always been extraordinary, and using it now for the purpose that Palpatine required. The temple burned. The archives that had held 12,000 years of accumulated knowledge went dark. The beacon that had called Jedi home from across the galaxy was reconfigured to broadcast a false signal warning survivors to stay away, and Obi-Wan, who arrived at the temple ruins and reached the beacon room and changed the signal back, did so while walking through what the temple had become, carrying the weight of what he saw with the specific quality of grief that has nowhere to put itself because everything that might have held it is also gone. He moved through those corridors with the measured pace of someone performing a necessary task, while also experiencing something that resists the performance of necessary tasks, the grief and the duty occupying the same body at the same time, with the particular tension that this cohabitation always produces. What Yoda and Obi-Wan understood in the days following Order 66 was that the shape of what had happened exceeded anything that grief alone could address. The Republic was gone, not ended violently, not conquered, but transformed through the final exercise of the powers it had willingly granted. Palpatine declaring the transformation into Empire before a Senate that applauded, that received the news of the Jedi's elimination as the resolution of a threat rather than the confirmation of one. Senator Amidala's observation from the gallery, her quiet statement that this was how liberty died, with thunderous applause, was one of the most accurate assessments made in that chamber in its entire history, spoken by someone who had spent years trying to prevent the outcome it was describing. Anakin had become Vader, and Vader had gone to Mustafar, and Padme had followed him there, and what happened on that volcanic world between them is the specific private catastrophe at the centre of the larger public one. Two people who had loved each other genuinely, whose love had been real in all the ways that love is real, meeting at the point where what Anakin had become could not coexist with what Padme was, and where the irreconcilability of those two facts expressed itself in the volcanic air above rivers of lava that had been flowing since before either of them was born. Obi-Wan was there, having followed Padme because he understood where she would go and what he would find when he arrived. What followed between him and Anakin on that burning shore was not a battle in the same sense the Clone Wars battles had been battles. It was a severance, the cutting of the deepest bond that either of them had. Obi-Wan left Mustafar carrying everything he had just lost, and the knowledge that the person responsible was not entirely the person he had lost it to. That what Vader was had been made, over years and through specific mechanisms and by a specific intelligence that had understood exactly what it was doing. He left carrying this not as an excuse for Anakin, but as a fact about the galaxy the story required him to hold. That the most terrible outcomes are not always the product of terrible people acting terribly. They are sometimes the product of ordinary damage meeting extraordinary circumstance in the presence of someone who understood how to use that meeting. This does not resolve anything. It is simply true in the way that the most important truths often are, inconveniently, incompletely, without providing the resolution that the scale of the suffering seems to demand. The Jedi who survived were few, and they scattered, and they went into the hiding that the galaxy's new shape required of them. Obi-Wan went to Tatooine, to the desert world where the story had begun, to watch over a child whose existence was a secret, and whose future was the last thing the story had left to work with. Yoda went to Dagobah, to the deep swamp of a world so strong in the living force that it could conceal even his presence from the eyes that were looking for survivors. They went into the quiet, into the long patience of people who understood that what had been lost could not be recovered quickly or directly, that the recovery, if it came, would come through means not yet visible, and in a time not yet arrived. Let everything go soft now. Order 66 is past. The Empire is declared. The war that was designed from its beginning to produce this outcome has fulfilled its purpose and consumed itself, leaving behind the Empire as its residue and the Jedi as its ghost, present in the Force, in the memory of the people who had known them, in the specific places where their presence had marked the galaxy with something the darkness had not yet fully covered over. The stars above Tatooine are the same stars they have always been. The desert is the same desert. In a small dwelling near the edge of the Yunlin wastes, someone is watching. Breathe out slowly. Let the night hold you. The story has one more place to go. We have come a long way together. 10 segments, 10 quiet hours, a galaxy built slowly in the space between your breathing. And now we arrive at the last one, at the place the story has been carrying us all along. Let your body be as heavy as it wants to be. Let your eyes stay closed, or let them close if they have not closed already. The breath is slow. The room is quiet. Everything that needed to be held has been held, and what remains now is only the final movement of the story, the settling, the stillness, the understanding that what we have spent these hours inside is not simply an adventure, but a meditation on how things end and what they leave behind and why any of it matters at all. Let that carry you. We are almost at the water's edge. The Galactic Empire was proclaimed from the Senate floor on a day that began as any other day, with the ordinary business of government proceeding in the ordinary way, with senators arriving and staffers preparing, and the great dome of the Senate chamber filling with the ambient sound of institutional life continuing its routines. The proclamation interrupted those routines with the quality of something that had been prepared so thoroughly that it was able to present itself as improvised, as the natural response of a leader to an extraordinary circumstance rather than the long-planned culmination of a design that had been running for decades. Palpatine stood before the Senate and told them that the Jedi had attempted to seize control of the Republic, that the threat they represented had been neutralized, and that in the interests of security and stability, and the continuation of everything the Republic stood for, It was necessary to reorganize the Republic into the first Galactic Empire under his direct authority. The applause that followed was genuine. Most of the senators who gave it believed what they had just been told. The institutions of the Republic did not disappear overnight. They were transformed, some immediately and visibly, others more gradually and more subtly, through the kind of incremental adjustment that large bureaucracies absorb without registering as change, until the accumulation of adjustments has produced something that bears very little resemblance to what existed before the adjustments began. The Senate continued to meet. Governors were appointed to the systems that had previously governed themselves. The clone army, which had been the Republic's army and was now the Empire's, continued to function under the command structure that had been developed during the war, with the Jedi generals replaced by officers whose qualifications were measured in loyalty to the new order rather than in force sensitivity or philosophical depth. Stormtroopers, the term came later, the white armor came later, the full visual iconography of Imperial military power came later, grew from the same white-plated clone soldiers who had fought on Geonosis and Kamino and 100 other worlds, wearing the same armor in the service of a very different purpose. Darth Vader emerged from the surgical theatre on Coruscant as something that was recognizably continuous with Anakin Skywalker and recognizably different from him in the ways that matter most. The same force sensitivity, the same raw power, the same foundational connection to the Force that had made Anakin the most gifted practitioner of his generation. But the specific texture of that connection had changed, because the dark side uses what it finds rather than what was placed there, and what it found in Vader was the wound, and the grief, and the rage, and the specific capacity for self-punishment of someone who understood, at some level he could not entirely suppress, what he had done and what it had cost, and what he had become in the process of arriving where he was. The armor was not merely medical life support, though it was that. It was the physical expression of the interior state, the sealing off, the enclosure, the conversion of a human being into something that could function without the vulnerabilities that human beings carry, and that had, in Anakin's case, been the mechanism of the greatest catastrophe in the history of the galaxy. Rest here for a moment. The war is over. The Republic is gone. The Jedi Order has been reduced to the handful of survivors scattered across the galaxy in their separate hiding places, each carrying the knowledge of what had happened, and the understanding that the direct recovery of what was lost was not possible. Not yet, not through any means currently available, not in the immediate time frame of any plan that could be made with the resources that remained. What remained was the long work of preservation, of keeping the traditions alive in the individuals who carried them, of protecting the specific people whose futures the Force appeared to be pointing toward as the means by which, eventually, something might be restored. This work was not dramatic. It was the work of waiting, of maintaining, of being present in the specific ways that presence is required when the larger action that presence is preparing for is still years away. Obi-Wan Kenobi on Tatooine lived the life of a desert hermit with the practiced simplicity of someone who had genuinely set aside the version of himself that had existed before, not suppressed it, not denied it, but integrated it into something quieter and more patient. A life in which the past was present but not loud, in which the grief was real but not disabling, in which the specific task of watching over the child on the nearby moisture farm was enough to organize each day around without requiring the larger purposes that the days of the war had provided. He meditated, he studied, he communed with the Force in the way that the desert permitted, which was deeply and without interruption, the silence of that arid world providing the conditions for an interior practice that the years of military command had made impossible. He was not wasting his time. He was becoming the person who would be needed later, in the way that preparation becomes the person preparing when it is done with full attention, over a long enough period. Yoda on Dagobah did the same work in a different register, the swamp world's rich Force presence providing a different kind of depth than the desert's silence, the teeming life of that ecosystem a constant reminder of the Force's essential character as something that connects and animates rather than something that merely powers. He communed with Qui-Gon, who had found in death what his unconventional approach to the Force had pointed toward in life, the ability to retain individual consciousness within the Force's larger current, to remain present and communicable beyond the physical death that ordinarily dissolved the individual into the larger whole. This was the gift that Yoda and eventually Obi-Wan would learn, the gift that would allow them to remain present in the story beyond their physical departure from it. Even in the worst ending, the Force had left something open. The clone troopers who had survived the war and Order 66 lived the aftermath in the specific silence of people who know what they have done and who carry the knowledge that the doing of it was not entirely their own. Rex removed his inhibitor chip with the help of someone who had fought alongside him and understood what the chip was, and he went on to live a life defined by the specific moral seriousness of someone who has been an instrument of something terrible and who has decided that the only available response to that fact is to spend the rest of the time available being something different. The clones aged at twice the normal rate. The accelerated growth that the Kaminoans had built into the design did not stop at maturity, did not spare them the acceleration in the other direction. And the soldiers who had fought through 3 years of the most intense conflict in the galaxy's history were old men within 2 decades, carrying their memories in bodies that had spent what they had been given faster than the bodies of the ordinary men whose faces they wore. What the Clone Wars left behind in the galaxy was not only the Empire, though the Empire was its largest and most immediately visible legacy. It left behind a transformed understanding. In the people who had lived through it, in the systems that had been shaped by it, in the Force itself, which the Jedi tradition understood as responsive to what happened in the living world, and which had been carrying the weight of the war's events, in ways that the Order's survivors could feel but could not yet fully interpret. It left behind the specific knowledge, in the people who held it, that the structures that felt most permanent were the structures most vulnerable to the specific kind of patient. Methodical dismantling that Palpatine had demonstrated was possible. It left behind the question, in every survivor who was honest enough to ask it, of what had been missed and when it could have been caught, and whether different choices at different points in the long sequence of events might have produced a different ending. It left behind 2 children, born on the day the Empire was proclaimed, carried in the last hours of their mother's life, given to separate guardians on separate worlds under separate names, so that the specific thing they were, the children of Anakin Skywalker and Padme Amidala, the offspring of the most powerful Force-sensitive being in the galaxy, and one of the most morally and politically significant women of her generation, would not be visible to the eyes that were looking. Leia went to Alderaan, to the household of Bail Organa, to a childhood of privilege and genuine love in a family that would shape her into the specific person the story would eventually need her to be. Luke went to Tatooine, to Owen and Beru Lars, to the same desert where his father had grown up, to a childhood of constrained horizons that would produce, in the specific way that constrained horizons sometimes produce, the quality of longing that would eventually make him unable to stay. The Force does not end its stories at the point that looks like ending. This is perhaps the most important thing that the Clone Wars teaches, for all its tragedy and all its loss and all the genuine devastation of what happened on the night the Jedi fell. What looks like the end is sometimes only the place where the most visible part of the story has run its course, where the large institutional narrative has arrived at its apparent conclusion, where the war is over and the Empire is declared, and the survivors are in hiding, and the darkness is as complete as it will get. It is not the end. The Force is still moving. The children are growing. Obi-Wan is watching. Yoda is waiting. The story that the Clone Wars made possible, the story of what comes after, of what was built on the ashes of what was lost, of what Luke and Leia would become, and what Vader would eventually find inside the armor, is already beginning in the specific quiet of Tatooine at night, under the same stars that watched Anakin leave and now watch his son sleep. Let the breath go out one more time, slowly, completely, all the way to the bottom of it. You have been to a galaxy far away and a long time ago, and you have sat with one of the great stories of what it means to be alive in a complicated world. A story about power and patience, about love and loss, about the specific ways that institutions fail, and the specific ways that individuals carry the consequences of those failures, about the force that moves through everything, and that does not stop moving when the things it moves through are broken. You have held the weight of it in the hour when the weight is most bearable, in the quiet before sleep, when the mind is open and the defenses are down and the stories that matter most can go somewhere deeper than the surface. The story is yours now. Carry it gently into the deep water. Let it go soft and warm as you go further under. The galaxy is at rest. The stars are still burning. You have done enough tonight. Let go.